In the vast melting pot of cultures that was New Spain during the 17th century, few individual stories have endured as powerfully as that of Catarina de San Juan, popularly known as La China Poblana. Her life, which began in distant India and culminated in the city of Puebla, stands as a historical testament to mobility, resilience, and cultural transformation. Catarina not only survived slavery and uprooting but also left a lasting mark on the visual and symbolic identity of the Puebla region. The influence of her clothing on the traditional China Poblana costume, along with her life as a free, devout, and respected woman, allows us to understand how an individual can become a cultural reference without seeking notoriety. This documentary narrative aims to reconstruct the events of her life with historical accuracy, distinguishing fact from legend and offering an objective perspective on Catarina de San Juan's legacy in Mexico. The story of Catarina de San Juan unfolds in the complex context of the 17th century, when New Spain was a meeting place for cultures, transoceanic trade, and forced migrations. Her life, which began in faraway India, eventually made her one of the most emblematic figures in the Mexican cultural imagination, both because of her personal presence and the influence of her attire on Puebla's traditional costume. Historical research allows us to reconstruct the facts clearly, separating legend from reality, and providing a documented view of a woman whose life crossed continents and oceans. Mirra, as she was called in childhood, was born in Agra, in northern India, in a social context marked by strict hierarchies and traditional power structures. Her origins have been described as belonging to a noble family, although historical documentation is limited, and many later narratives mix fact with legendary elements. What is known is that, while still young, Mirra was captured by pirates during a journey in which she collected shells for trade or transport, as was common in coastal Indian communities. This episode took her to Cochin, on the southwestern coast of the subcontinent, where she was sold as a slave to merchants operating along the Indian Ocean trade routes. The slave trade between Asia and the Americas was a historical reality during the 16th and 17th centuries, though it is often underrepresented in popular accounts. Mirra was purchased by Miguel de Sosa, a merchant and captain based in Puebla, Mexico. According to contemporary records, Sosa was seeking a woman who fit the exotic fashion preferences of the new Spanish elite, and he bought her to serve in his household. The young woman was baptized as Catarina de San Juan, following the Catholic custom of giving a Christian name to those converted to Catholicism after capture or arrival in the Americas. After the death of Miguel de Sosa and his wife, Catarina gained her freedom, which allowed her to make autonomous decisions about her life. Eventually, she married a servant of Chinese origin named Domingo Suarez. This union, documented in parish records and contemporary accounts, marked a period in which Catarina consolidated her identity within New Spanish society, while preserving aspects of her cultural roots through her clothing and customs. Historical narratives show that, despite the difficulties and marginalization she faced as a foreign woman and former slave, Catarina developed her own style, which drew the attention of her community and left a lasting mark on Puebla. Catarina's relationship with her attire is one of the most studied aspects by historians and anthropologists. Her outfit, described as a white blouse with colorful embroidery and a long skirt adorned with sequins and ribbon, eventually became the inspiration for what is now known as the China Poblana costume. Popular interpretation has mixed Catarina's Asian heritage with elements of local clothing, creating a visual symbol associated with both femininity and Puebla's regional identity. Studies of iconography and material culture indicate that the China Poblana blouse incorporates features of Indian clothing fused with new Spanish styles, while the skirt and adornments reflect adaptation to local customs. Records from the period show that Catarina lived a devout and austere life after gaining her freedom. She dedicated herself to religious practice and community life in Puebla, maintaining her personal style without seeking fame. However, her figure began to attract popular admiration, and after her death in 1688, she became a kind of cultural symbol. The people of Puebla began to associate Catarina's image with virtues such as independence, kindness, and female resilience, while her attire became part of the collective imagination for regional festivities and dances. The historical context of New Spain partly explains the fascination with Catarina. New Spanish society was highly hierarchical and stratified, with clear distinctions between criollos, mestizos, indigenous people, African slaves, and other groups. The arrival of a woman of Asian origin who had experienced slavery and attained freedom represented an exceptional case. Her story, preserved in neighbors' accounts, local chronicles, and parish documents, offered an example of atypical social mobility and resilience in the face of extreme adversity. For this reason, Catarina gradually became part of Puebla's cultural memory and a reference for female identity in New Spain. The costume that inspired the China Poblana not only reflects a mix of cultural influences but also carries symbolic meaning associated with freedom and autonomy. The blouse, simple in cut but adorned with embroidery and bright colors, symbolized the resistance and expressive capacity of a woman who had survived slavery. The long skirt allowed freedom of movement during dances and festivities, reinforcing the connection between clothing and social ritual. Historians emphasize that, although popular legend often exaggerates the exoticism of her attire, evidence shows that Catarina wore her garments practically, modestly, and in accordance with the norms of her time, while conveying a distinctive identity to her community. Cultural analysis of Catarina's figure also reveals how New Spanish society processed otherness and exoticization. The young woman of Indian origin and her subsequent adaptation to life in Puebla demonstrated how the integration of foreign elements could create new cultural symbols. The fusion of Asian clothing, local materials, and New Spanish aesthetics gave rise to a costume that transcended her personal origin to become intangible heritage of the region. Festivities and dances that incorporated the China Poblana consolidated this legacy, establishing a tradition that endures to the present day. Catarina de San Juan is remembered not only for her attire but also for her influence on religious devotion and community life. Historical records show that she dedicated much of her life to charitable works, caring for the sick, and participating in religious rituals. This combination of personal virtues and distinctive style allowed her figure to be positively represented in collective memory. The people of Puebla began to see Catarina as an example of dignity, strength, and inner beauty, attributes that reinforced the narrative of a woman who, despite being a slave and foreigner, earned respect and admiration in local society. Catarina's impact on Mexican culture extended beyond her lifetime. Oral tradition, artistic representations, and later studies have cemented her image as the prototype of the China Poblana. Historians agree that the myth cannot be entirely separated from reality, but documentation allows a clear distinction of facts: her Indian origin, capture and transport to Mexico, religious conversion, freedom, life in Puebla, and the influence of her clothing on folk tradition. This historical clarity is essential to understanding how a concrete individual can generate lasting cultural symbols and how collective memory transforms a personal life into regional heritage. Catarina's influence is also evident in the way Puebla and Mexico have reinterpreted her story over the centuries. Festivities that include the China Poblana dance represent not only a tribute to the aesthetic of her outfit but also a celebration of the values associated with her figure: resilience, freedom, and cultural integration. Dance and music, accompanied by the vibrant colors of the costumes, allow each generation to connect with a documented historical past, transmitting knowledge about trade, migration, and social relations in New Spain. Anthropological and cultural history studies have highlighted that Catarina de San Juan is an exemplary case of transculturation. The combination of Asian and New Spanish elements in her attire reflects a process of adaptation and fusion that extends beyond aesthetics to include social relations, religious practices, and gender norms. Detailed observation of contemporary documents indicates that Catarina did not seek notoriety or political influence. Her impact arose from the combination of her origin, personal experience, and presence in Puebla's community life. Historical documentation about Catarina also provides insight into the lives of women in New Spain, especially those of foreign origin or who had been enslaved. Society was strictly hierarchical and patriarchal, and female social mobility was limited. By obtaining her freedom, Catarina became an exceptional example of autonomy and personal agency. Her story invites reflection on how women could influence material and symbolic culture, even in restrictive contexts, through choices of clothing, religious participation, and carefully negotiated social relationships. Analysis of iconography and later pictorial records confirms Catarina's influence on the representation of the China Poblana costume. Images show a stylistic evolution but consistently retain fundamental elements: embroidered white blouse, long colorful skirt, and details evoking the original Asian aesthetic. This pattern, repeated in illustrations, engravings, and photographs throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, demonstrates the persistence of Catarina's legacy and the Puebla community's ability to keep historical memory alive through tangible symbols. Catarina de San Juan's life ended in Puebla in 1688, but her influence continued to grow through oral tradition and local cultural practices. The city consolidated her figure as a female and cultural reference, integrating her story into the region's folklore, art, and education. The legend of the China Poblana, though embellished with later symbolic and narrative elements, has a solid historical core: the story of a woman who crossed oceans, survived slavery, and left a tangible legacy in Puebla's cultural identity. The final reflection arising from the historical study of Catarina de San Juan is that individuals can create lasting symbols without seeking fame or notoriety. Her life demonstrates how personal resilience, cultural integration, and expression through clothing can transcend individual experience and become collective heritage. The China Poblana is not just a costume or a legendary figure, it is a historical testament to cultural mobility, transoceanic interaction, and the female presence in shaping regional identities in New Spain. Recognizing Catarina's documented life allows for a better understanding of the historical processes that shaped Mexico and highlights the importance of collective memory in preserving concrete facts and cultural lessons. In summary, Catarina de San Juan represents a meeting point between history and material culture, between documented reality and popular memory. Her life, grounded in verifiable historical facts, reveals the complexity of New Spanish society, the transoceanic trade and slavery routes, and how an individual can leave a lasting imprint on regional culture. The clothing that inspired the China Poblana continues to symbolize identity, freedom, and resilience, reminding us that even the most everyday acts of a personal life can become cultural references that transcend centuries and borders.